Well, g'day there everyone. Welcome to yet another exciting week of readings as we journey through the Bible in a year and do so to the best of our ability in chronological fashion. We're up to week number 21 in our readings. Last week the focus of the story really was a guy called Absalom. Absalom was one of David's many sons, and as we saw there with the drama in that father-son relationship spilled over into a very public political battle between them. Absalom ended up losing his life, and David well and truly is still established on the throne as king of Israel. This week we are spending our final week focusing on David. It's our seventh and last week with a focus on David's character and his complexities, I guess you might say. We are finishing off the book of Samuel, so congratulations. We're going to do that, the last 3 chapters this week, and also finishing off the book of First Chronicles. Remember, Samuel and Chronicles were both originally written as one book each, okay? First and Second Samuel split when the Bible was put into Greek, so was Chronicles. So this week we're finishing off Second Samuel and we're finishing off First Chronicles, which basically finish together with the last days of David's reign as he is prepared to hand his role over to King Solomon. This week you're also going to be reading 16 Psalms, most of which are written by David, almost all of which are songs of praise. So that's good. It's a feel-good psalm week this week, not many lamentations coming up. What else? Oh, and one of those psalms is written by Solomon, incidentally, Psalm 127, where he famously says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its labourers labour in vain." Key words to come from Solomon, because as we find out this week, not only does Solomon take over from his father David, but Solomon is also the one commissioned with building God's house there in Jerusalem, or at least around Jerusalem at this stage. I'll explain that in a moment. 3 things you need to pay attention to this week in the big Bible narrative. 3 key events that take place that you really need to focus on. The first thing you're going to see happen this week is that David takes a census of essentially the fighting men in Israel, and God does not like this idea. Okay, now you need to do your own study on that as to why God might have not liked this. Okay, but God does not take to it kindly, and what he does is he responds by sending a plague on the people of Israel. The prophet Gad is there, okay, prophesying this is going to happen, rebuking David, telling him it's basically his fault, okay? And just like happened in the days of Moses in the desert, where God's people would disobey him, and an angel of death and destruction and plague would come out against Israel, so it also happens here. Literally, an angel from heaven comes, and a plague over 3 days sweeps through the whole nation. Tens of thousands of people die. And when that angel is seen just outside of Jerusalem, on the top of a mountain, just out of the city, David sees the angel there. The owner of that hill sees the angel there, and Gad says to him, "David, you can stop this if you want to." So he goes up to the top of the mountain where the angel was. He purchases that block of land, okay, that plot of land from the owner there, who is a Jebusite. He's not an Israelite. He's not a Hebrew. Okay, he's one of the guys that used to live in Jerusalem. Okay, that group of people, the Jebusites that used to live in Jerusalem. This is now on the outskirts of Jerusalem, on the top of a hill. David buys that piece of land, offers God a sacrifice there where he sees the angel, and that angel withholds his hand and the plague stops. Now, why is that significant? Because it is that plot of land, it is that hill just on the outskirts of the current city of Jerusalem that will become the Temple Mount. It is that place where King Solomon ultimately will build God a temple. In Solomon's era, Jerusalem grows to include the Temple Mount, but at this stage it's small, so it's not quite there, which is why that piece of land belonged to a foreigner. So there you go. So you're going to read that story of the plague this week. You're also going to come across an interesting dynamic in the different ways that the story is told between Samuel and Chronicles. I've explained this in the last few weeks a number of times about how Samuel and Chronicles both tell the same stories but in very different ways, and you're really going to notice that this week. And I don't want to give anything away or go down that rabbit hole because I've got heaps of notes that I was going to share, but it's going to take too long. Anyway, you can read about that yourself. Okay, either way, whatever happens, the point is David discovers the place where he's going to build God's temple. The second thing that happened is David makes extensive preparations for this temple. So just like Moses, again, was commissioned by God to build a tabernacle and got very, very specific instructions from God as to how that tent was to be built, that tabernacle was to be built. So David's the same. God gives him very specific instructions as to how it was to be built and how it was to be run. And this basically ushers in a whole new era of worship for God's people, okay? No longer would the tabernacle be significant. No. God has now highlighted a place in the promised land, okay, where he will put his name. He has highlighted that place now, and this will be the place where worship will take place, where the national festivals will be celebrated, and Israel will come and celebrate those festivals 3 times a year. So this is a very, very, very significant thing in the whole history of God's people, something that Moses prophesied years ago and would be relevant to basically the whole rest of the Bible story. The picture of the temple is a key theme that we see continues all the way through, literally to the end of the book. So essentially, the book of Samuel that we're finishing this week begins, you might remember, with Samuel's parents crying out to God for a baby. You remember 1 Samuel chapter 1? And they do that at the tabernacle of Moses in Shiloh, which is where Joshua had left it after they came in from the promised land. So Samuel begins with the tabernacle in Shiloh, and the book of Samuel ends with the location of the new temple that is going to be built. The book of Chronicles gives heaps more details than that, but of course you'll be reading it this week. So David makes a census. The location and the temple preparations begin. And the third key thing that happens is that David hands over his kingdom to his son Solomon, and Solomon takes the throne. And again, like Moses did with Joshua, okay, this is done because of a clear word that God had spoken to David, apparently, or put it on his heart, said that Solomon is the man, he's the man to take your place. And just like Moses to Joshua, this is the only time in Israel's history where a successful and seamless succession takes place from one leader to the other. I mean, you remember the handover from King Saul to King David was really messy. Okay, this is not like that at all. This is a very, very peaceful and successful handover, and we'll read a little bit more about that next week as we venture into the book of Kings. So there's 3 things that happened this week. A census, which results in the plague on the top of the mountain, is stopped. That mountain becomes the place of the temple. David prepares for that temple and hands over to Solomon. That's the big picture of what you're going to see in the narrative this week. And there's way more I could say about that. But I want to spend some time on one last thing before I leave you this week. And it has to do with paying attention not only to the narrative of the scripture, but to the developing language of the scripture. So listen up, pay attention, don't tune out. A couple more minutes and then we'll be done. This week, the first chapter you're going to be reading is 2 Samuel 22, and the whole chapter is basically a psalm. And if you think you've read it before, you have, okay? It's also known as, Psalm 18, okay? And David wrote this psalm after all his enemies were defeated. It says that right there in the introduction. He wrote it after the death of Saul, and after all David's enemies had been defeated, he wrote this chapter. And it occurred to me as I was reading it this week that the language that David uses in this psalm and in others mirrors that of Moses' songs in Exodus 15 and Deuteronomy 32. You remember that Moses famously wrote 2 songs. One of them was as they came out of the Red Sea. It was a song of praise, okay? His first song. His second song was right before he dies, 40-something years later, where he writes a prophetic song over Israel, telling them how disobedient they're going to be in the future, okay? So one's a happy song, one's a pretty depressing song. We read both of those, Exodus and Deuteronomy. And the language of those songs, I believe, is mirrored a lot by David. So I want you to pay attention to that this week. They both speak about waters of death that dry up at the blast of God's nostrils, okay? They both speak about God being a rock and all his ways are perfect. They both talk about God spending his arrows against the enemy and causing me to stand on the heights. There's a few key phrases in there that are literally identical that David borrows, I believe, from Moses. And you see here the use of highly poetic and metaphoric language. The whole psalm is about God defeating David's military enemies. When David prayed to rescue him from the overwhelming onset of death that was against him. How did God do that? How did God rescue David all those years? Well, it's simple. He shook the very foundations of the earth. He shook the very foundations of the heaven. Fire came out of God's mouth. Smoke came out of God's nostrils. He shot arrows of lightning. He rebuked the sea by the blast of his nostrils. God parted the heavens. God came down on the clouds, and he came down with angels. That's how he did it. Well, okay, not literally. What God literally did was help David fight military battles and win. But as David sings about those victories, he uses very metaphoric language where literally the heavens, the skies, the earth, and the seas, all created order, was affected by God, shaken by him, clouds parting, God coming down and being with him. So that very physical, practical victory of war is described in this deeply metaphoric language, and I think much of that is seen and echoed from Moses. I want you to pay attention to that, because not only did Moses begin that language, David continues it, and as we go over the next few months, we're going to see that kind of language, that style of writing, okay, used again and again by the prophets, and even all the way through into the New Testament. The point is this: as we read through the scripture chronologically, we're not only noticing the timeline, okay, of key events and key places and key people. That's one thing we need to notice. But the other thing I want you to notice is the use of language, okay, uses of figures of speech that progress all the way through the scripture. And we're going to see a continuity and a developing in figures of speech as we keep reading. So I want you to pay attention to that this week. All right? Bless you guys heaps. Enjoy. Finish off Samuel. Finish off 1 Chronicles. And enjoy those Psalms. I'll catch you next week for week 22. Bye.